Hi, welcome. Welcome back to our study on the Esther. This is a continuing study for a ladies' Bible class that we will be continuing today. This presentation will cover chapters 3 and 4 of the book of Esther. So if you have your Bibles ready, Esther chapter 3, and we will begin going through chapters 3 and 4 and learning what we can from the Esther. If you'll remember back to lesson 1, I mentioned that Esther is the only woman mentioned in Scripture whose name is used the most times. Her name is mentioned 55 times in Scripture. There's no other woman that comes close to that other than Sarah, who comes second in that regard. She's also the only second woman in the Bible who has a book named after her. So this makes her story a significant part of Old Testament history, and there are valuable lessons we can learn from the life of Esther, which is why we are doing this study. So let's begin in chapter 3. Now, at the end of chapter 2, we see Mordecai discovering a plot on the king's life. He reports the plot to Esther, who then reports it to the king. And after investigation, there are 2 men that are found guilty of plotting to assassinate the king, and they are put to death. So one would expect at the beginning of chapter 3 that we're going to see some accolades, some recognition given to Mordecai for this act, because he did in fact save the king's life. That's not what we at the beginning of chapter 3, we see a new man introduced that we have not previously. His name is Haman. So we're going to look at verses 1 and 2 and see what we are introduced to in chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set him above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him, but Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. So that's what we are introduced to. We see Haman, who is an Agagite. And you might ask, what is there a significance to genealogy? And yes, there is. If you'll remember back to 1 Samuel, when God commanded Saul, King Saul, to go and destroy the entire nation of the Amalekites for not aiding the children of Israel as they go through the wilderness. Saul was told not to leave one person alive in that nation. We know that he did spare the king's son, and the king's name was Agag. Apparently, Haman is a descendant of that king who was later put to death by Samuel. But we see him as being a descendant of that genealogy. Several generations removed by the book of Esther. So this is going to play a significant part in our explanation as to why Haman feels the way he does regarding the Jews. Saul, being a Jew, and his army going in and massacring, as they would see it, the nation of the Amalekites, there would be reason then to hold grudge, or there would be a reason to hold a grudge or perhaps a prejudice against the Jewish people. And we're going to see that play very significantly here in the story in chapter 3. So the relationship that we see, question 1 asks to describe that relationship between the king. We see that Haman is promoted to the second most important person in the kingdom. He was honored by the king by this promotion, and has also commanded all subjects of the kingdom to bow down to Haman and pay him homage because of his position. This led Haman to become very prideful about his position, the honor and the recognition that he was to receive from all in the kingdom. You can see how it would be difficult not to start thinking a little bit more highly of yourself than you should, because as you pass people coming and going and doing your official duties, people were bowing down to you, reminding you of your position in the kingdom. One person refused to do this, Mordecai. And as Haman entered and exited the palace daily, probably, he would see Mordecai refusing to bow or pay any kind of homage to him. So this is going to set up a situation that continues in chapter 3. So let's look at verses 3 and 4. Then the king's servants, who were within the king's gate, said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Now it happened, when they spoke to him daily and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with wrath. So Mordecai's questioned by the other people in the kingdom. Why are you not bowing down to Haman? We've been commanded to do so. Why are you refusing to obey this command? So he tells them that he is a Jew. And as we know, the Jewish people bowed down to no man, only to their God. And Mordecai would not go against his beliefs or his conscience in this regard. He refused to pay the homage to Haman that the king had commanded, which means he puts himself in jeopardy of disobeying a direct command of the king. But he felt his honor and his duty to the Lord was more important. Haman is told of this. He's told why Mordecai will not bow down to him. And this fills Haman with wrath. He becomes so filled with wrath and anger that he comes up with a plot that is definitely way over the top when we're just talking about one man. But it also goes to describing the amount of pride that Haman had in his position. So continue reading in verse 6. But he disdained, meaning Haman, to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So, of course, Haman would want to get rid of Mordecai, just having done away with, but being the position he was in, he really couldn't do that. He didn't have a reason, per se, to do away and have Mordecai executed. So he comes up with a way to cover up his real agenda and decides that he'll go after the entire number of Jews that are still living in the kingdom of Persia. So he comes up with this plan that he would go to the king and he would ask the king to make a decree, which, remember, once a decree was made, could not be changed, that all of the people that lived in his kingdom who were Jewish would be killed. So he goes to the king, he puts forth his plea, and this is how he words it in verse 8 of chapter 3. There was a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. So he does a little bit of a misrepresentation of the truth here. It true is indeed that the Jews had some laws or religious laws they followed that the people in the kingdom of Persia did not follow, because for the most part the people in Persia were pagan god worshippers, whereas the Jews worshiped the one true God. But they were not rebellious people. They were not causing an insurrection or a problem. They would quietly go about their lives, doing their things that they did by day, but following the commands of the old law. So we see Haman here misrepresenting them, calling them, making the king think that they're about to rise up against him in rebellion. He also offers to pay a great deal of money into the king's treasury. We see that in verse 9, 10,000 talents of silver, which would motivate the king, again, to follow his request, because the king, having just had a disastrous defeat in Greece when he went to try to conquer that nation, probably needed to replenish his treasury because military campaigns were very expensive. So we see the king agreeing to the decree. He goes so far as to give Haman his signet ring, which means giving Haman all authority to write whatever decree and command he wished and seal it with the king's signet ring, making it official. So he's basically given Haman a blank check here. Do whatever you wish to do with these people. Question 4, I ask, what leadership error did the king make regarding Haman's plan? Well, we know he did no other investigation. He takes Haman's word for exactly what it was that Haman presented. He doesn't check with any of his other princes who ruled in the 127 provinces of his kingdom. We see him doing no other further investigation, but rather believing Haman at exactly what he said, and he's going to trust Haman, which we find later he trusts the wrong person, which happens in life. So apparently the relationship between the king and Haman was such that Haman had, to this point, given the king no reason to believe he was disloyal in any way. He sees this as an act of loyalty, actually, on the part of Haman. He's protecting the king and his kingdom from people who would perhaps try to rise up against him. So the decree is sent out. It's written up in all the languages of the provinces, and it is carried out throughout the kingdom by courier. And we mentioned earlier that they had one of the best road systems of the time, which expedited the passage of messages and information throughout the vast kingdom of Persia. So all of the kingdoms, villages, cities, etc., received the written decree that on a certain date, all Jews would be annihilated. If we read in verse 13, and the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is of the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. So this is the decree that goes out throughout the entire provinces, as I said. So now all Jewish subjects who are living in the kingdom of Persia are going to become aware of this new decree. Now it's several months away before the day will actually happen, possibly God's providence working there. So it didn't happen immediately, giving time for other events to take place. So in question 5, I asked to describe the attitude of the king and of Haman as we see evidenced in verse 15. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, and the city of Shushan was perplexed. So quite a contrast here. We see the king, Haman, basically celebrating, sitting down, having a drink together, confident that their actions are right, confident that they are doing the right thing. No show of sadness or remorse for the death of all of these people that's about to happen. And they're blinded to the consequences that such an action may bring into the kingdom. So we see here an example of without a godly foundation or influence in our lives, this can lead to a progression of sin that leads a person into very sinful and hateful acts, which is what we see in Haman's life. He has no godly influence, no godly foundation. He's rejecting everything that he might have heard about the one true God. And he is of his own arrogance and pride decided what law should be. And he's going to take the lives or be responsible for the taking of thousands of lives without remorse, without any sadness or regret. So this is how we end chapter 3. The city is perplexed. They're in a state of confusion. They don't understand why this decree has gone out. The Jewish people had never done anything to bring any kind of threat to the king. So why in the world is this happening? Many of them, were not aware of Haman's hatred and prejudice against the Jewish people, most especially against Mordecai. So we open chapter 4, learning that Mordecai, when he read the decree, ends up putting on his sackcloth and ashes, which is in the Jewish tradition the way of showing deep mourning. Sackcloth was made of goat's hair, which was a dark colored and very coarse fabric. It was a loose fitting garment, so it was not what you would normally see people wearing. They would take ashes from a cold fire and they would throw the remains of these ashes over their heads and onto their hair, their face, their body, so that it gave them more of a ghostly ashen look and this was to signify that they were in deep mourning. And they also we find that they are in verse 4 that they were fasting, they were weeping, they were wailing, and that many lay in sackcloth and ashes. This was an Eastern culture tradition of how they express grief and mourning. Us in the Western culture, we are more reserved in the way that we express grief. But in the Eastern cultures, even today, you will see this kind of mourning take place, the wailing, the loud noises they make, the crying, the wearing, they rip their clothing, they do all sorts of things to indicate that they are in mourning. So Esther becomes aware through information she receives through her messengers and people that work in the palace that Mordecai is out in the city. He cannot come in the king's gate with the sackcloth, but he's out in the city square, and someone reports to Esther that he is in sackcloth and ashes. She knows this indicates something's wrong. She doesn't know what yet. She cannot communicate directly with Mordecai. She's in the palace in the women's quarters, guarded by a number of people, no doubt. So Mordecai cannot go where she is, and she cannot come out into the city king's gate and see him. So all their communication has to go through a third person. When she becomes aware that he has been sitting in this sackcloth and ashes, she's deeply troubled and distressed, and immediately sends garments to Mordecai to see if he will accept them and change into clean clothing. He does not accept them. He refuses them. Her maids and her eunuchs came and told her of what was happening. And so she now is perplexed as well as to understand what is going on. Why is Mordecai in mourning, and why won't he accept these gifts I sent of clean clothes? So she has to send a trusted eunuch, one of the king's eunuchs, it tells us in verse 5, who the king had appointed to attend her. She gives him a command, it says in verse 5, to learn what was going on from Mordecai. So he goes out into the city square where Mordecai is, and he inquires, why are you in sackcloth and ashes? What has happened? So in the beginning of verse 7, we learn that Mordecai tells him all that has happened, the sum of money that Haman has promised to pay, to destroy all the Jews, and he gave him a copy of the decree to take to Esther so she could see it for herself in writing, could see the king's seal on this letter, knowing that it was official and from the king. So the trusted eunuch, Attash, however you pronounce his name, returns to Esther in her quarters and gives her the report, tells her what is happening, why Mordecai is in great mourning and distress. He tells her all the words of Mordecai and shows her a copy of the decree. Now, after Esther learns the purpose of this great mourning, she has a decision to make. What am I going to do about this? Because I'm Jewish, but nobody in the palace, as far as we know at this point, knew that. So Esther again sends Mordecai, and in the request that he sends, all the information that he sends with this eunuch to Esther, he sends her a request as well at the end of verse 8 to make supplication to the king and plead before him for her people. So Mordecai wants her to use her position as queen to go to the king and try to plead on their behalf to see if she can persuade the king to change his mind. He would have to issue a new decree, as we know, because once a decree was issued, it could not be changed. But there was a way to stop it if Esther was willing. And she was in a position where Mordecai felt she would have the greatest influence at this point. However, in question 4, I ask, what law would Esther have to violate in order to carry out Mordecai's request? We see her explain that in verses 10 through 12. Then Esther spoke to Hattash and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, and that he may live. So that was her only chance. Yet I myself have not been called in to see the king for 30 days. So they went back, Hattash went back and delivered that message to Mordecai. Esther says, it's a law. You can't just go into the king anytime you want unless he calls for you. If you do, you can be put to death unless the king extends the golden scepter to you. She had not been called in to see the king in 30 days. That was significant. He had not requested to see her in all of that time. And now she's just going to show up out of the blue in the king's court. It would put her life at risk. And she wants Mordecai to understand that. Now, remember, Mordecai raised Esther. He knows Esther's character better than anyone else in the kingdom. And he knows what she's capable of if she's given the right perspective. So that's what he gives her in the return message. He tells her, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So Mordecai's return message to her information that, hey, I can't go to see the king anytime I want is, don't think that you're going to escape this decree. Once it's discovered you're Jewish, you will be put to death as well. And someone else, Lord will deliver someone else to come to the rescue of the Jews. Mordecai was certain in his trust and faith in God that God was not going to allow this to happen, that he would send someone to rescue them. He asks Esther, maybe that's why you're queen. Maybe that's why you've been put in this position. Maybe that's why the Lord's providence has worked in this way, that you are here at this particular moment in time for this specific reason. That gives Esther the perspective she needs, and she sends a message back to Mordecai in verse 15 and 16. Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will go to the king. No, my maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So she decides to do it, but before she does, she wants to have 3 days of fasting, time to think, time to contemplate, time to get her mind set and prepare herself for this very, very difficult mission that she is going to have to carry out. She would risk her life by going, and that's why we have the very famous words of, if I perish, I perish. If this is what God intends to happen, then it will happen. If his desire is that I die, then at least I will have died trying to do what was right. But to stay silent would also put her at risk, because she would more than likely also be put to death along with her other fellow Jews. So with humble obedience, she decides to go to the king. And she's going to take 3 days to fast, and she asks Mordecai to make sure that all of the other people, Jewish people in the city, do the same, and she and her maids will do the same. Now, some might ask, why wait? Why wait 3 days? What's the purpose in that? Some of us probably would have rushed in immediately to the king very rashly and demanded that he listen to us and be very emotional in our approach about how you can't do this. How can you kill all these people? What have they done to you? That could very well have been her approach if she had not taken some time to think about what she needed to do. This was a serious thing she was getting ready to do. It's not like our culture today, where if our husbands have made a decision we don't agree with, we can just talk with them at any point in time we want and try to persuade them otherwise. She had to follow the protocol. She had to follow the law of the land. She was queen, but she was still required to follow the protocol of the palace. So during those 3 days, we see Esther fasting, which means she takes the focus off of the physical and puts it on the spiritual. Rather than preparing food and all of the things that you do when you're fasting or eating, you take that time and you devote it to spiritual things. You spend it in prayer. And through her prayer, she's going to gain new strength that she will need. She's going to get a better perspective on what it is that's going to happen if she doesn't do this. She will store up the extra energy that she's going to need to stand before the king bravely and make her request. And she deepens her determination to persevere. If the king extends the golden scepter to me, I will make my request. And she was determined to persevere no matter what. And if he had not extended his golden scepter to her, and indeed did have her killed, she would have faced that with bravery as well, understanding that that was the Lord's will in this situation. You are not waiting in vain when you take time and take a step back to determine your next action. Nothing different will happen, more than likely, whether you rush in immediately or not. And that's Satan talking when he tries to tell you, the 3 days of waiting ain't going to make a difference. The Jews are going to be killed no matter what you do. Who are you to think that you're going to be able to go to the king and persuade him to change his mind? That's Satan working. He wants to fill our minds with doubt and fear so that we won't step up and do the brave thing. We don't see Esther giving into that kind of temptation during this time. She's understanding what many of us understand with the significance of one. Sometimes it just takes one person to stand in the gap, as Ezekiel 22:30 says. Or no man, no justice, no intercession. When God sought that in the kingdom of Israel, he found no one that was standing for justice. And then in Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 1, God asks, if you can find a man, if there is anyone who will stand for righteousness, I will spare the nation. Couldn't find one. So making a difference starts with you and I. We need to believe in the impact and power of one person's actions, standing up for what is right, putting ourselves at risk, understanding it is better to do that than live with the regret and horrible consequences. How could Esther have lived with herself? If she had by some miracle prevailed and not been killed along with the rest of her people, how would she have lived with the regret of that action? Knowing she could have possibly changed it and didn't do anything. She trusted in God, as we need to do, to control the things that we cannot. Esther could not control what the king would or would not do when she went in to see him. She could not control whether the decree would be carried out or not. All she could control was what she decided to do and how she approached the situation. She stepped out of her comfort zone, as we have to do when we need to stand up for what is right, and remember what our purpose in life is. We are not here on earth to live a comfy, cozy life. We are here to serve the Lord. And sometimes that means putting things at risk, standing outside the comfort zone and doing things that are hard. But we do it for righteousness' sake. We do it because it is the right thing to do. And that is the decision that Esther came to at the end of chapter 4. She doesn't hesitate once Mordecai puts her in that position, and she recognizes that's probably why I'm queen. So we see God working here in all of the events that take place, and he's setting up things to be exactly the way that he wants them to be. We also see the progression of hatred in the heart of Haman here, and we're going to see more of that in chapter 5. The hatred in Haman's heart grew to the point where he could see no other thing to do than to murder or have people murdered. It's a big thing to have that kind of control over the lives of others, that you get to decide who lives and who dies. Haman took that responsibility very pridefully and arrogantly, making it, he wanted to have the right to do that. He thought he did have the right to do that. And so we see him doing that. The king probably had this rule about no one coming in unless he called them for many reasons. I mean, we need an appointment to see important officials in our government today. We can't just wander in and expect to be seen at random. It also could have been to protect him from possible threats to his life, because in royalty, especially in the times of Esther, kings and their families were constantly under threat of being assassinated or killed, so their kingdom could be taken over and their power could be taken away. So he had some good reasons for having this law, and he made it a strict law to deter others from just wandering into the palace at will and having these people come in without proper protocol. So Esther is fasting for 3 days, she and her maids. The city of Shushan is also fasting, and Mordecai makes sure that everyone knows this is what we're doing. We're doing this to pray for the success. He knows what's on the line. The Jewish people knew what was on the line. If Esther was not successful, who else in the kingdom would possibly have the position or the influence to make the case known before the king? And remember, I said earlier, the king did no investigation into this matter. He has no idea what the Jewish people are doing in his kingdom, other than what Haman told him. This is something we need to be aware of as well. Don't take one person's word for things if we don't have evidence to back it up. Don't make a judgment about other people unless we know for a fact those things to be true. And then remember that we are not in a position to really be the judge in the first place, but God is the judge, and we are to give that place to him. So there are so many lessons, both good and bad, that we can learn from the study of Esther, and I hope that you will be applying those to your life, as well as I will be doing the same. Learning to be brave and confident in my trust in the Lord, to know that whatever I'm called upon to do by him, he will help me, he will be there, he will see that I have the things that I need to carry out the work that he's given me to do. So in our next presentation, we will cover chapters 5 and 6 of Esther. And I had one final question I wanted to discuss before I close this presentation, and that is that shouldn't being used by God to accomplish his purpose be the goal of every Christian? And I had you refer to Romans chapter 9, verses 20 and 21. So let's turn there and give this some thought about the fact that I am to be a vessel, to be used by God to carry out his work here on earth. And let's see, Romans chapter 9, verses 20 and 21. But indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? Does not the potter have power over the clay, from the same lump to make one vessel for honor, and another for dishonor? Probing questions. Do I have the right to answer against God and say, there's no way I'm doing this? Am I in a position to tell He who created me what I'm created for? Do I have the right to go against the purpose of my creation? Absolutely not. These are all rhetorical questions that Paul asks here in Romans. The answer is obviously no. We do not have the right to do those things. We are not the potter. We are the clay. We are the thing formed by the person who forms us, that being the creator. So we are to remember that. God made us, and He did not create us to be used, and He can use us in either an honorable or dishonorable way, as we see here in the book of Esther. Haman was, of course, used in a dishonored way, Esther in an honorable way, but God makes the decision there. We must allow God to use us for His purpose and to fulfill that purpose to the best of our ability. We see in today's society what happens when people decide they're the potter, they're God, they're going to decide what gender they are, what sex they are, how they're going to live their life, whether they're going to engage in this particular activity or not. They're going to make all the decisions. They're not going to bow to the authority and the creator God. They're going to make all those decisions. And we see the results, and will be continuing to see the results of those actions in our society. It's going to leave our society in turmoil, chaos, misery, because we're going against the creator. You can't do that. You're not the creator. You're not the one that makes those decisions. So yes, accomplishing God's purpose should be the goal of every Christian, no matter what He has created us to be. And remember, He's created us all with different talents and abilities. And as women, we are given a unique role in the lives of our family and in the church to fulfill those roles the way God has created us to do so. So going outside of that, trying to be the potter instead of the clay, will only end in disaster, and we will lose our eternal salvation. So these are the thoughts that Esther contemplated during her 3 days of fasting. I know it's decisions we have to make every day as Christians as to whether we're going to stand up for what is right or compromise the truth and go along with things that we know are wrong. So we all have these challenges to face, and I pray that we will all face them bravely and with courage and confidence in our trust in the Lord, that we will pray and ask God to fill us with His courage and with His strength to be able to live the life of Christians in the world that we live in today, as Esther had to do in her world. I thank you for watching, and I hope that you gain some insightful inspiration and edification in your study. And in our next presentation, as I said, we will go into chapter 5 and 6 of Esther. Thank you.